What if I told you that Denmark has placed over 10,000 massive wind turbines in some of the world's most violent ocean waters, and these structures are now generating enough electricity to power entire countries while accidentally creating underwater ecosystems that support more marine life than natural reefs? It sounds impossible, right? Well, Denmark has been quietly building this oceanic energy empire for over 30 years, and the consequences have shocked even the most optimistic energy experts worldwide. This is that incredible story of conquering the seas. But to understand why Denmark would attempt to build thousands of massive structures in the hostile North Sea, we need to go back to 1973. That year, the global oil crisis devastated Denmark's economy and exposed the country's dangerous dependence on imported fossil fuels. Unlike other European nations that possessed significant coal, oil, or gas reserves, Denmark imported over 90% of its energy, making it extremely vulnerable to international price shocks and supply disruptions. Picture this. Denmark was spending nearly 40% of its export earnings on energy imports, creating a massive trade deficit that threatened the country's economic stability. The 1973 oil embargo had quadrupled energy prices overnight, forcing Danish industries to shut down and leaving ordinary citizens unable to afford heating during the harsh Scandinavian winters. The government was forced to implement emergency energy rationing, including car-free Sundays and restrictions on building heating. But Denmark possessed something that most energy-rich nations lacked: some of the strongest and most consistent winds in the world. The country sits in the path of powerful Atlantic weather systems that generate almost constant wind across its flat landscape and surrounding seas. More importantly, Denmark's position between the North Sea and the Baltic Sea placed it in one of the windiest marine environments on Earth. The numbers surrounding Denmark's wind resource were extraordinary. Offshore winds in Danish waters averaged 8 to 9 meters per second year-round, with some areas experiencing wind speeds that could generate electricity over 90% of the time. These weren't gentle breezes. They were powerful, consistent air currents that contained enormous amounts of kinetic energy waiting to be harvested. However, the challenge of capturing this energy seemed insurmountable. Wind turbine technology in the 1970s was primitive and unreliable. The largest turbines generated only 55 kilowatts, barely enough to power a few homes. More critically, no one had ever successfully built large-scale wind installations in marine environments, where salt water, extreme weather, and massive waves created engineering challenges that had defeated previous attempts. The Danish government, led by Prime Minister Anker Jørgensen, made a decision that would transform the global energy landscape. Instead of continuing to depend on imported fossil fuels, Denmark would become completely energy self-sufficient using wind power. The plan was audacious. Denmark would not only develop advanced wind turbine technology, but would also pioneer the construction of wind farms in the ocean itself. Critics thought the idea was economically suicidal. Dr. Erik Nielsen from the Danish Technical University argued that offshore wind installations face engineering challenges that make them prohibitively expensive. The cost of electricity from ocean turbines will be 5 to 10 times higher than conventional power sources. International energy experts predicted that the harsh marine environment would destroy any turbines within a few years of installation. The technical challenges were indeed staggering. Ocean-based wind turbines needed to withstand hurricane-force winds, 20-meter waves, and constant salt spray that corroded metal and electronics. They required foundations that could be anchored in seabeds up to 50 meters deep, while supporting structures over 100 meters tall. Most critically, they needed maintenance systems that could operate in conditions where access was impossible for weeks at a time during winter storms. Environmental groups were equally skeptical. Marine biologists warned that large structures in the ocean could disrupt fish migration patterns, interfere with shipping lanes, and create underwater noise pollution that might affect whale and dolphin populations. Commercial fishermen feared that wind farms would destroy traditional fishing grounds and eliminate access to productive ocean areas. International energy companies showed little interest in investing in unproven offshore wind technology. The engineering risks were enormous. and the economic returns were highly uncertain. Most experts believed that if ocean wind power had any future, it would require decades of research and development before becoming commercially viable. But Denmark had several advantages that other countries lacked. As a small, wealthy nation with a strong engineering tradition, Denmark could implement coordinated national policies and invest in experimental technologies. The country's long coastline and shallow continental shelf provided ideal conditions for offshore construction. Most importantly, Denmark's wind industry could build on its growing expertise in onshore wind technology. The first experimental offshore wind turbine was installed in 1991 at Vindeby, a small island off Denmark's coast. The project consisted of 11 turbines, each generating 450 kilowatts, installed in just 3 to 5 meters of water. While tiny by today's standards, Vindeby represented a technological breakthrough that proved offshore wind generation was possible. The early results were encouraging. The offshore turbines generated 20–30% more electricity than identical onshore turbines due to stronger and more consistent ocean winds. More surprisingly, the turbines caused minimal environmental disruption and actually seemed to benefit marine ecosystems by creating artificial reef structures that attracted fish and other marine life. But scaling up from 11 small turbines to thousands of massive installations required solving engineering problems that had never been confronted before. How do you transport 100-meter tall turbines to ocean locations? How do you install foundations in deep water during winter storms? Most critically, how do you make offshore wind economically competitive with conventional power sources? The answers required innovations in every aspect of offshore construction. Danish engineers developed specialized ships capable of installing turbine foundations in rough seas. They created new foundation designs that could anchor massive structures to ocean floors. They pioneered maintenance systems that allowed technicians to service turbines in conditions that would be impossible on land. The breakthrough came with the Horns Rev wind farm, constructed in 2002 in the North Sea, 14 kilometers from Denmark's west coast. This massive installation featured 80 turbines, each generating 2 megawatts, creating the world's largest offshore wind farm at the time. More importantly, Horns Rev demonstrated that offshore wind could be built at utility scale and operated reliably in some of the world's harshest marine conditions. But Horns Rev was just the beginning. Denmark's plan called for covering vast areas of its territorial waters with wind installations, creating an oceanic energy infrastructure that would make the country a net energy exporter. The scale of construction required would be unprecedented. Thousands of turbines installed across hundreds of square kilometers of ocean. Environmental opposition continued as the scale of construction became clear. Marine conservation groups worried about the cumulative impacts of massive offshore development. Shipping companies complained about restrictions on navigation routes. Even some renewable energy advocates questioned whether the environmental costs of large-scale ocean construction could be justified. But research was beginning to show that the environmental impacts of offshore wind farms were far more complex and generally more positive than critics had predicted. Studies around early installations found that turbine foundations were actually enhancing marine biodiversity by creating artificial reef environments. Fish populations were increasing rather than decreasing around wind farms, apparently benefiting from the protection from fishing that the installations provided. The construction boom that followed the success of Horns Rev transformed Denmark into the world's leading offshore wind power nation. Between 2005 and 2015, Denmark installed over 1,000 offshore wind turbines across multiple massive wind farms, including Horns Rev 2, Anholt, and Rødsand. But this was just the preparation phase for something even more ambitious. Denmark's plan to cover its entire continental shelf with wind installations. The engineering challenges grew exponentially as installations moved into deeper waters and more exposed ocean locations. The Anholt offshore wind farm, completed in 2013, required installing 111 massive turbines, 15 to 20 kilometers offshore, in water depths of up to 19 meters. Each turbine stood 140 meters tall, with rotor diameters of 120 meters. making them larger than most skyscrapers and visible from shore as giant sentinels guarding the Danish coast. But perhaps the most impressive achievement was the development of specialized offshore construction capabilities. Danish companies created an entire industry focused on ocean-based renewable energy installation. Massive construction vessels capable of lifting 1,000-ton turbine components became routine sights in Danish waters. Floating cranes that could operate in 5-meter waves revolutionized offshore construction techniques. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. By 2010, Denmark's offshore wind industry employed over 25,000 people and generated $3 billion annually in export revenues. Danish companies like Vestas, Ørsted, and Dong Energy became global leaders in offshore wind technology, winning contracts to build installations worldwide. What had started as an energy security project had become Denmark's largest high-technology export industry. International recognition of Denmark's success led to a global boom in offshore wind development. The United Kingdom launched massive offshore wind programs based on Danish technology and expertise. Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands followed with their own large-scale projects. By 2015, European offshore wind capacity exceeded 10,000 megawatts, with Danish companies involved in over 80% of global installations. But the real breakthrough came with the development of truly massive offshore installations that could generate electricity at costs competitive with fossil fuels. The London Array, built by Danish companies in UK waters, featured 175 turbines generating 630 megawatts, enough electricity to power 500,000 homes. These utility-scale installations proved that offshore wind could provide baseload power for entire regions. The technology continued to evolve rapidly. Turbine sizes increased dramatically, with new installations featuring turbines over 200 meters tall, generating 8 and 15 megawatts each. Floating foundation technologies allowed installations in waters over 50 meters deep, opening vast new areas for development. Advanced maintenance systems using helicopters, boats, and even autonomous drones reduced operational costs significantly. The environmental research results were consistently positive and often surprising. Marine biology studies around Danish offshore wind farms documented 30–50% increases in fish populations compared to similar areas without installations. The turbine foundations had created extensive artificial reef systems that supported diverse marine ecosystems. Some species that had been declining in the North Sea were recovering in areas around wind farms. Perhaps most remarkably, the installations were creating new marine habitats that hadn't existed before. The exclusion of fishing around wind farms allowed seafloor communities to recover from decades of trawling damage. Rare species, including harbour porpoises and seals, began using wind farm areas as protected feeding and breeding grounds. The ocean around Denmark's turbines was becoming more biodiverse than it had been for over a century. By 2018, Denmark had achieved its original goal of energy independence and had become a major energy exporter. Offshore wind provided over 50% of the country's electricity, with onshore wind contributing another 30%. On windy days, Denmark generated more renewable electricity than it could use and exported the surplus to neighboring countries through underwater cables. The success attracted massive international investment and technology transfer. China launched the world's largest offshore wind development program, initially using Danish technology and expertise. The United States began developing offshore wind resources along its Atlantic coast with Danish companies as primary contractors. Even oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE began investing in offshore wind technology. But Denmark wasn't finished expanding its ocean energy infrastructure. The country announced plans for energy islands, artificial islands in the North Sea, that would serve as hubs for massive offshore wind installations, generating 10,000 megawatts or more. These energy islands would be connected to multiple countries through underwater cables, making Denmark the center of a European renewable energy network. The construction of these energy islands represented the ultimate expression of Denmark's oceanic energy vision. Located 80 kilometers offshore in 25 to 35 meter deep water, the The first energy island would cover 18 hectares and serve as the hub for 200 massive wind turbines. The island would include accommodation for maintenance crews, helicopter landing platforms, and electrical infrastructure capable of distributing power to multiple countries. International energy experts who had once dismissed offshore wind as too expensive were forced to acknowledge Denmark's achievement. Offshore wind had become the fastest-growing renewable energy technology globally, with costs falling below conventional power sources in many markets. The International Energy Agency predicted that offshore wind could become a $1 trillion industry by 2040. The geopolitical implications were equally significant. Denmark's control of offshore wind technology and expertise had made the small Scandinavian nation a major player in global energy markets. Countries seeking to develop offshore wind resources needed Danish technology, equipment, and expertise, giving Denmark significant influence in international energy policy. Climate change mitigation had become a major driver of offshore wind expansion. The technology offered the potential to generate massive amounts of clean electricity without requiring land that could be used for agriculture or other purposes. The IPCC identified offshore wind as one of the most promising technologies for achieving global carbon reduction goals. The success had also transformed Denmark's relationship with the ocean itself. What had once been seen primarily as a transportation route and fishing ground had become the foundation of the country's energy security and economic prosperity. The Danish model proved that marine environments could be productive partners in sustainable development rather than obstacles to overcome. By 2020, Denmark's offshore wind installations covered over 1,000 square kilometers of ocean and included more than 2,500 individual turbines. The generating capacity exceeded 6,000 megawatts, making Denmark's offshore wind fleet larger than most countries' entire electricity systems. The installations were producing clean electricity equivalent to removing 10 million cars from roads annually. Educational and research impacts extended far beyond energy technology. Danish universities had become global centers of excellence for offshore wind research, attracting students and researchers from around the world. The accumulated knowledge from 3 decades of offshore construction was being codified into new engineering disciplines and international standards. What happened over the following years transformed not just Denmark, but the entire global understanding of what was possible in renewable energy development. The most remarkable development was the completion of Denmark's first artificial energy island in 2023. The massive 35-hectare platform, located 80 kilometers offshore in the North Sea, serves as the hub for 400 giant wind turbines spread across 1,000 square kilometers of ocean. Each turbine stands 260 meters tall and generates 20 megawatts, making them the largest wind turbines ever constructed. The energy island itself houses 200 technicians and engineers who maintain the offshore installations using advanced robotic systems. Dr. Katarina Larsen, who became Denmark's chief offshore wind engineer in 2022, described the energy island as a floating city dedicated to harvesting ocean wind. The platform includes helicopter landing facilities, accommodation blocks, maintenance workshops, and massive electrical infrastructure capable of distributing 8,000 megawatts of power to 6 different countries through underwater cables spanning over 1,000 kilometers. Perhaps most astonishingly, the energy island has become completely energy self-sufficient, using offshore wind to power all its operations, including desalination plants that provide fresh water, electric charging stations for maintenance vessels, and even controlled environment agriculture systems that grow fresh food for the resident workforce. The island represents the ultimate integration of renewable energy technology with sustainable living systems. The environmental transformation around Denmark's offshore wind installations has exceeded every prediction. Marine biological surveys conducted in 2024 documented over 300 species of fish, marine mammals, and seabirds living around the turbine foundations, a 400% increase compared to similar areas without wind installations. The turbine foundations have created the largest artificial reef system in European waters, supporting marine ecosystems that rival natural coral reefs in diversity and productivity. Most remarkably, several marine species that had been considered locally extinct have re-established populations around the wind farms. Harbour seals, which hadn't bred in Danish waters for over 50 years, have established breeding colonies on the energy island platforms. Grey seals have increased from near extinction to over 5,000 individuals living permanently around offshore installations. The protection from fishing provided by wind farm exclusion zones has allowed these marine mammal populations to recover dramatically. The economic impact has transformed Denmark into a global energy superpower despite its small size. Danish offshore wind companies now control over 60% of the global offshore wind market, generating $15 billion annually in export revenues. The industry employs over 100,000 people in Denmark alone and has created an entire ecosystem of specialized engineering, manufacturing, and service companies. International expansion has been extraordinary. Danish companies are building offshore wind farms on every continent, from massive installations off the coasts of Taiwan and Japan to pioneering projects in emerging markets like Brazil and India. The total global capacity of Danish-designed offshore wind installations exceeds 50,000 megawatts, making Danish offshore wind technology one of the most successful clean energy exports in history. The technological evolution has been equally impressive. The latest generation of offshore turbines features 25 megawatt generators with rotor diameters of over 250 meters, larger than the height of most skyscrapers. Advanced floating foundation technologies allow installations in waters over 100 meters deep, opening vast new areas of ocean for wind development. Autonomous maintenance systems using drones and underwater robots have reduced operational costs by 40% while improving safety and reliability. Perhaps most significantly, Denmark has achieved something unprecedented in energy history: complete decoupling of economic growth from carbon emissions. The country's economy has grown by 150% since 1990, while reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 75%. Offshore wind provides 70% of Denmark's electricity, with the remainder coming from onshore wind, solar, and biomass. On many days, Denmark generates more renewable electricity than it can use and exports the surplus to neighboring countries. The success has created new approaches to international energy cooperation. Denmark's underwater cable network connects the country to 12 different nations, allowing renewable energy to be shared across thousands of kilometers. During periods of high wind, Danish offshore installations can provide electricity to Germany, the Netherlands, and even the United Kingdom. This international grid integration has made renewable energy more reliable and cost-effective across all participating countries. Climate impact has been transformational. Denmark's offshore wind installations prevent the emission of over 50 million tons of CO2 annually, equivalent to removing all passenger cars from Germany. The technology has become one of the most effective climate change mitigation strategies available, with potential to generate enormous amounts of clean electricity without competing for land needed for agriculture or conservation. Urban planning has been revolutionized by offshore wind success. Danish coastal cities have been redesigned around offshore wind operations, with specialized ports, manufacturing facilities, and research centers creating new forms of industrial waterfront development. The city of Esbjerg has become the unofficial capital of global offshore wind, hosting the headquarters of major wind companies and serving as the staging point for installations worldwide. Educational transformation has been equally significant. Denmark's universities have become global centers of excellence for offshore wind engineering, attracting thousands of international students annually. New degree programs in offshore renewable energy combine marine engineering, electrical systems, and environmental science to train the workforce needed for global wind development. The success has also created new forms of international diplomacy and cooperation. Denmark's offshore wind expertise has become a major component of the country's foreign policy, with technical assistance programs helping developing nations access clean energy technology. The Danish model is being adapted for local conditions in countries from Vietnam to Morocco, creating a global network of offshore wind development. Innovation continues to accelerate with experimental technologies that could revolutionize offshore energy even further. Airborne wind systems that capture high-altitude winds using tethered turbines could generate electricity at even higher capacity factors. Wave energy systems integrated with wind turbine foundations could capture energy from ocean waves as well as wind. Offshore hydrogen production facilities could convert wind electricity into stored fuel for transportation and industrial applications. By 2024, the economic returns from Denmark's offshore wind investments had exceeded all projections. The total investment of $50 billion since 1991 had generated over $200 billion in economic value through electricity sales, exports, and job creation. More importantly, the avoided costs of fossil fuel imports and climate change damages had saved Denmark an estimated $100 billion compared to conventional energy development paths. The geopolitical transformation has been equally dramatic. Denmark's small size no longer limits its global influence when that influence is based on technological leadership in the world's fastest-growing energy sector. Danish offshore wind technology is helping countries achieve energy independence while addressing climate change, making Denmark an essential partner for sustainable development worldwide. The lesson of Denmark's offshore wind revolution extends far beyond energy technology. It demonstrates that small nations can achieve global leadership through focused investment in emerging technologies and sustained commitment to innovation. Denmark proved that natural disadvantages, in this case, lack of fossil fuel resources, can be transformed into competitive advantages through creative problem-solving and long-term vision. As thousands of Danish wind turbines continue to spin in oceans around the world, they represent more than just clean electricity generation. They symbolize humanity's ability to work with natural forces rather than against them, to create sustainable prosperity through technological innovation, and to transform environmental challenges into economic opportunities. The sight of massive wind turbines rising from ocean waves, generating clean electricity while supporting thriving marine ecosystems, represents a new chapter in humanity's relationship with the natural world. Denmark's conquest of the seas through wind power proves that the transition to sustainable energy is not just possible, but profitable, and that the technologies needed to address climate change can become the foundation of economic prosperity for generations to come.